Welcome to PubSci, everybody. Thank you so much for turning up. Apologise to those who had some problems joining for whatever technical reason. Actually, I just turned my camera on, so I'm a person. Yes, thank you very much for joining. This is the first PubSci we've held since June last year. As Paolo was explaining earlier, some of you might have heard PubSci was set up actually 10 years ago this October, I believe, by Paolo Viscardi. It was June, was it? Okay. So very close. Paolo Viscardi and James Robson to bring science to people through informal means, but make it sort of accessible and interesting and scientifically valid as well. And it's been in various establishments. Most recently, we spent a lot of time in the Old King's Head in Borough. And if you can see me in a little picture, you will see a backdrop, which is the Old King's Head, where obviously we can't be at the moment. So it's an absolute delight to be kicking off our 2021 season with Paolo Viscardi. Paolo's not just a great guy and a wonderful friend, he's also co-founder of PubSci. It was his idea with his friend James, and they ran it for until about 5 years ago. Was it you moved to Ireland, I think?
Yeah, it is now. God, scary how quick the time goes.
Yeah, it really does. Paolo's zoology curator at the National Museum of Ireland. He's a trustee of the National Sciences Collections Association. His background is in biomechanics, and he's particularly interested in bones, especially other people's bones or other creatures' bones, to be fair. Obviously, he's a keen science communicator. He's worked as consultant and script editor on TV and documentaries. He's now based in Dublin. He was previously at the Horniman Museum in South London. And it's an absolute delight to welcome Paolo Viscardi to talk about Dismantling the Dead Zoo.
Thanks very much, Richard. I hope you can all hear me, and I hope that that everything's running as smoothly as it can do. Let's see how it goes. I've got quite a lot of slides, and some of them have video. If there are any problems, then I can make them available through other means at some point. But to be honest, mostly this is just a quick overview about the way in which we've been dealing with quite a major undertaking in the Dead Zoo, which is the Natural History Museum in Dublin. So it's part of the National Museum of Ireland. So for those of you who don't know the museum, I'll just give you a very quick tour. It's a little virtual tour here. So this is a section through the building. This is actually created from a bunch of scans that the architects have taken to understand how the building's put together, because it was built in 1856, 1857, it opened. It's obviously kind of an old building. It hasn't really had any significant work done to it since then. I mean, they've improved various bits and bobs over time. And certainly the collections have changed to some extent over that time. But the shell of the building hasn't really changed in any appreciable way since it was first opened. And one of the big problems with that is that with historic buildings everywhere, there are a million issues. And so we're constantly having to deal with those problems. And that's fine, we can deal with them. But unfortunately, we have to deal with them around a huge load of other stuff, lots and lots of material. So I'm just going to give you a very quick whistle-stop tour of the museum. So this ground floor here is what we refer to as the Irish Room, and that represents the species that you find in Ireland and the coasts and the waters around Ireland. So it also has specimens which are found in the ground in Ireland, so things like the giant Irish deer, and you'll see quite a lot of those on the walls around the sides there, these gigantic 3-meter wide sets of antlers on these incredible skulls. The entrance to the building is over on the kind of left-hand side of your screen, and this kind of section here on the right-hand side, and I'm using the little cursor there to indicate it, but you might not see that. That on the far right-hand side, that's a stone staircase, which is the main way up and down into the first floor, which is this area here, and that's the mammals of the world. And that space is quite beautiful. I'll show you some pictures in a second, but it's really, really densely packed. And more than just kind of that level of animals from all over the place, including things like elephants and kudu and elands and all sorts of stuff. Kangaroos, you name it, we've got it in there. It's a really good collection. We then have 2 balconies that go up from that. So you have your birds and fish on the middle balcony. Birds, fish, reptiles, and so on. And on the top balcony, you have invertebrates. So it's quite a remarkable feat to squeeze so much material on display in that building. It's actually really fantastic for the diversity it shows. We've got over 10,000 objects on display in that space, which is actually quite a huge amount when you consider some art galleries will only have that many objects in their entire collection. The museum has about 2 million objects for the Dead Zoo alone, and then we've got another couple of million for the rest of the museum collection. So we have a lot of stuff, and this is what you see when you enter on the ground floor. So the first thing that you really see are the giant Irish deer, which obviously they are synonymous with Ireland. They're incredible things. But what you notice is that there's an awful lot of these mahogany cases. There's a very historic feel to the space. The space itself is old, and that's actually part of its virtue. We consider ourselves a bit of a museum of a museum, which, as far as we're concerned, is something which has value, has genuine value for the people that come to visit us, because they come and they see this space and they remember it when they first came as a child, and now they're bringing their kids, and it goes back generations and generations and generations. So we have people who are in their kind of 80s turning up, and they remember coming when they were very small children with their grandparents who were in their 80s. It's that kind of place, and it hasn't changed significantly in that time. So when you get to the first floor, and this is the area that I'll be talking about quite a lot, you have a very, very high density of cases packed full of stuff. And also you have some large open display objects. And you can just about see the whales hanging from the ceiling there, but I'll talk about them in a lot more detail. The big taxidermy is just fills the space in a remarkable way. So it's really good that we were able to get close to it, that people can get in and see it. Sometimes it's kind of a little bit hard to move around in the space when you have a large number of members of the public in the building, because people really like it. We had around 400,000 visitors last year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but at the moment we only have 2 floors open in this. Although it's an impressive building, it's actually relatively small. So it's quite a tight squeeze. Now, the 2 balconies spaces haven't been open to the public for a few years because there's an issue with the structure of the building, actually. It's just not a sound building. So on those balconies, you can just make out up here some birds of prey and so on. So you have a huge amount of stuff packed into those cases. And then above that, you've got even more. And of course, you can just make out along the top there and lower down. There are lots of game heads, and they are basically put on every available surface because we've got so many of them. It's a really good way of displaying them. And most of those have come in from large kind of historic homes, stately homes, and so on, where they've had those things in their personal collections, and they give them to us when the owner dies. And some of those collections are actually really important, and not just those game heads, but kind of all sorts of collections that are on display are really important objects. So this one in particular was recently used in research. It's Pyrenean ibex. It's an extinct species. It's actually the species that was cloned or attempted. There was an attempt to clone it a few years back, and although it was a successful attempt to clone it, only survived for a few hours. But the point is that we have huge amounts of really important scientific material. We have extinct species, we have type specimens, which are the particular individual objects which are used to describe entire species. And it's what scientists refer back to when they are talking about the discovery of new species and understanding the species which already exist. It's actually kind of one of the main functions of museums. And the problem is that we have to keep that stuff in good condition. And unfortunately, having a historic building like we have a somewhat restricted ability to do that. So back in 2018 in March, we got the beast from the east, which brought a huge amount of snow, which was quite fine, being blown in from a direction that we don't normally get a lot of weather coming. So in Ireland, most of the weather comes from the west, and usually it's rain, which is why Ireland's beautiful and green. Unfortunately, the snow caused a lot of issues. So I'm not sure if you can see me kind of moving the mouse around the screen, but you can see little white piles, dirty white piles on this kind of walkway here. That's actually snow that had blown into the roof. And then you might be able to see some of these little kind of pools here forming on the top of this glass ceiling. And that's the meltwater from that snow. And so basically we got a large amount of snow coming into the building. And it rained inside the collection space for a couple of weeks as that snow melted, and obviously that caused us a huge amount of problems. A large number of the objects were getting rained on, basically, and so we spent quite a lot of time trying to fix this issue, trying to make sure that we had a safe space for people to walk around, and so they weren't slipping in puddles of water. But more importantly, well, no, not more. Just as importantly, we had to make sure that these specimens, these historic objects, which we've had for, some of them for, well over 150 years, we had to make sure that they were safe. So we had to build tents and raincoats for the animals. And you don't want to find yourself in that position. It's not where you want to be. So really, this problem with the roof, which led to this kind of horrific situation, which has been ongoing, because once that happened, it meant that any subsequent heavy storms, we end up getting water getting into the building. So it's an ongoing problem. Basically, it meant that we have to change our roof. And changing the roof of a historic building like this is a big undertaking at the best of times. But when you consider that we have 2 whales hanging from the roof, it suddenly becomes a bigger problem, because it's not even a case of just being able to cover everything underneath it. We literally have to move those whales in order to be able to get access to that roof and to take it apart to be able to put a new one in. So as a zoology curator, a year ago, I was basically told, yes, the roof works are going to happen. So you have to come up with a plan to get those whales down and to make the space inside that building safe for that roofing work to happen. And so that's what I did, and that's what I'm really talking about today. So a lot of that is not very exciting stuff to have as a slide, and you probably can't see this if you're looking on a small screen. And to be honest, you don't need to. This is just an idea of the kind of plans that we work with when we're doing the initial phase of discussing how we're going to go around, get around this problem. There are other kind of ways of planning the space and trying to figure out how we're going to be able to get access to get these things down without causing major problems with the rest of the space, because decanting museum spaces it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money, because you've got a large number of objects which have to be moved in a safe way. So the idea for this particular project was to move as little as possible and to protect as much as possible in order to allow the roof works to happen, because otherwise we weren't going to get a new roof for a very, very, very long time. So this is one of my kind of sketches from going into the space and trying to actually work out how these 2-dimensional plans actually work with a 3-dimensional space. And it kind of gives you an idea of how you have these large objects which don't necessarily get very well represented in kind of plans and sketches and drawings when they're done by architects. And you have to be able to kind of understand them in a very different way. You have to understand how they interact with things like the balconies. So the whales, where they actually come to on the balconies. If you don't understand that, then it means that when you put in your scaffolding to take those things down, you don't know what else is being affected by that scaffolding going in. And obviously that's absolutely essential. Another major issue is how you get things in and out of the building, and the space is severely restricted. It's a very tightly packed space. You can barely get kind of 2 people passing in that space. Certainly with COVID, you can't do that safely now. You certainly don't have anywhere. You barely have 1.5 meters clearance, never mind 2 meters. So we had to work out a plan for getting things which are quite large out of the building and finding routes to do that, because actually most of this stuff was brought into the building before we ended up having the kind of the end of the building cut off. So we used to have a very large open corridor where you could bring quite large objects into the space. That was gone. That was lost because the building that we used to be connected to has been handed over to the Senate for different purposes. So it puts us in a slightly difficult position because we don't have any doors or openings big enough to take large objects out of. So when it comes to moving large objects, we got started with the things which were relatively easy to move. So our giraffe, although he's very tall, He's fairly easy to move, and so this is just us kind of wheeling him down through one of the narrow spaces. And as long as you have someone upstairs keeping a hand on his head to stop him from wobbling around too much, it's a relatively straightforward process. When you start getting to larger things like our walrus, it becomes much more problematic because they're much too wide to fit down the space. So basically, we had to flip it on its side and then to put it on wheels. So again, there's a lot of work involved in that. It looks like a fairly straightforward process. You just need a big team of burly lads. Hey, to flip it over, grand, no problem. Of course, that also, you have to prepare for that. You have to build a stillage. That's what this wooden frame around this particular object is called. It's a stillage, and what that does is it holds it still. And you can see there's an awful lot of padding. This white material, which kind of goes on the timbers, is called plastozote, and it's a high density foam, which we use a lot in museums. It's really, really versatile stuff. And by using materials like that and using the timber and basically making sure we have a well enough constructed frame with good carpentry, it means that you're able to spread the weight of the object around that frame as it turns. There's a huge amount of planning that goes into that. And for an object like a walrus, you'd think that would be quite difficult, but actually it's an easy thing. A stuffed walrus is kind of like a sofa. It's like a leather sofa, basically. You've got some upholstery on the inside, and you stretch over some leather, and you're kind of there. That's what it is. So it's actually a relatively straightforward thing to deal with. Although it does weigh about 0.5 ton, so it's not a light thing to deal with. It's a lot of work involved in moving and a lot of planning because you don't want anyone to get hurt and you don't want the object to get damaged. But still, it's quite straightforward. We have an awful lot of other things which had to be moved in order to make space. So this entire area that I'm showing here, this is comprised of this. Well, this area comprises our landing area for whale skulls and whale bones. So we had to clear everything out of that space, and it was a very, again, there's an awful lot of planning, and we had to sequence everything that moved quite carefully to make sure that we didn't move it before there was a space for it or after there was no space for it. And there's a certain amount of investigation going on to see what was happening in the space. So as soon as you start opening up the plinths underneath those objects, you find stuff. So there's various boxes of stuff. Under the rhino skeleton, we found a completely inexplicable electric hob. I don't know why that was there. No one seems to know where it came from. But for some reason, someone was storing an electric hob under our rhino. Okay, it's the kind of thing which we need to move. We need to be able to kind of get out of the way before we start moving the objects, because if you try to move it when you have those sorts of things underneath it, you end up having problems. So the rhino itself, this is kind of an illustration of the kind of things you have to think about when you're moving large skeletal specimens. Taxidermy is relatively easy. Skeletons are, quite frankly, a bit of a nightmare, because when you build an armature to hold a skeleton, effectively what you do is you wire on ribs, or you balance bits on. So these skulls are literally, they have a single piece of metal rod, which sticks up through the back of the skull, through the hole, the foramen magnum at the back of the skull. And it basically, the skull sits on that piece of metal. And then usually there's some kind of pin holding it in place to stop it from just sliding off. Now, this particular skull, it's a rhino. It's a relatively heavy skull. And one of the things that we discovered as we were working on it was some, things that we hadn't really noticed before, because we never looked at it in the right kind of way. We'd noticed that the animal had had some kind of abscess on its front right lower jaw, just behind the incisors there, which you should be able to see around this area where we're moving. So that was actually damage that happened in life. That was something we'd noticed because it's an interesting feature of the animal. What we hadn't really paid much attention to is the fact that on the far side, on the left-hand side of its skull, there's an awful lot of damage. And actually, I've got a little bit more detail on that here. So clearly, this skull had fallen at some point and landed on its left-hand side, and it basically had smashed this is the cheekbone here, the zygomatic arch, and down here on the lower jaw. All of this area has been repaired with bits of wire, with plaster, and so it's not a stable place. You can't handle it from that that point. So when you're taking those sorts of things apart, you have to be really, really careful to make sure that you're not grabbing it in those convenient handhold that actually turns out to be a broken handhold. It's like trying to pick up a cup of tea without using a handle, and that handle has been broken in the past and repaired, and the repair isn't very strong. You just can't do it. You can't be handling it in that way. So you have to really inspect the objects before you try to move them. Once we got the skull off, and it was relatively straightforward, but once we understood how the skull was put together, we had to build what we call a stillage, and I mentioned that before for the walrus. But here, when you're dealing with the skeleton, the stillage has to work in slightly different ways. So there's an awful lot of points where we have to suspend using straps or cotton ties, and we kind of buffer between the bones in order to produce a structure which prevents too much vibration from going through the skeleton, breaking the bones or damaging the wire that holds the bones onto the stillage that's been built, the armature that's sitting inside as well, which is usually made of iron or steel, depending on how old it is. Other things we need to do are moving cases. Now, some cases are relatively easy to move. This is Nigel. He's not a case. He's not an object. That's the keeper of natural history and a real mentor for me. He's kind of really helped shape my museum career. I learned a large amount of what I know about museums from Nigel when I first started in the business. And here he is moving some peccaries and pigs out of the pig case so that we're able to move that. And that case, that's a heavy case. That takes kind of 12 people to lift it. And the beauty of cases is that once they're up, you can usually find ways of kind of getting supports underneath them. When they've got these legs, you can stick these little casters underneath, and they actually wheel around fairly easily. Unfortunately, not all cases are so easy to move, and these are historic. They're made of mahogany. They've got plate glass in them, and they weigh a ton, literally a ton, or more. They're very, very heavy. They're very difficult to move. They're very delicate and fragile. If you move it in the wrong way, it causes flexion in the case, in the actual timber framing, and that can smash the glass. And if that glass breaks, it's incredibly dangerous because it doesn't break in the way that modern kind of safety glass breaks. It breaks as big shards with sharp edges. And so, you can literally lose a limb if you happen to be too close to it and the glass breaks. So this is our preventative conservator, Sylvia, who is really heavily involved in this project. She's absolutely fantastic. And unfortunately, she's just headed off to Australia for a year. So I hope we see her back again when she's finished spending time with friends and family. She's originally from Australia, and she just had enough of not being able to see anyone over the last year with COVID. So unfortunately, she's away for a while, but hopefully we'll see her back. But here she is trying to add some lubricant, in this case some washing up liquid, to the floor, because effectively we've got grease, we've got dirt, we've got old varnishes, we've got all sorts of things going on with the floor, which basically weld those cases because of the weight and because of the time they spend sitting in that one place. They weld them to the floor. So the idea in this case was to add a bit of lubricant, and then, and this is a video which I'll just play in a second, then we use ratchet straps to increase the amount of force on the cabinet in quite a controlled way to help us just break the seal, which is welding it to the floor. So I'll show you that in action. So it doesn't seem like a huge amount of movement, but just that little move is all it takes to break the seal. And from that point, we were able to actually completely move that case into a new position, which made quite a big difference to us being able to plan out where we were going to be putting things like the scaffold. And really, that's what all of this kind of these moves, this is what all of this kind of shifting stuff around is about, is being able to install a scaffolding that was going to actually be located on the floor in places where we could take the load of the weight that was going to come from a huge amount of steel, an amount of steel that was going to be able to take the weight of a whale being dismantled. And whales are notoriously heavy. Other things that we had to move in order to make way for that scaffolding were the game heads. And we have an awful lot of them. We've got 333, which is a nice number in that gallery space. And we didn't have to move all of them straight away, although we will have to move all of them before the roof is actually is worked on. We had to move about half of them to get access for the scaffolding. And they are a range of different species, and so therefore they're a range of different sizes and weights. These are some of the bigger ones, but they're not actually the heaviest. The heavier ones will be things like this hippo skull, and this is on the ground floor. And we had to find ways of getting these things down which were going to be safe. And one of the major problems that we have in this museum space is that the floors aren't strong enough to take a large amount of kind of lifting equipment. So you can't come in with a cherry picker or something like that and take these things down using mechanical means. You have to do it manually. It's all installed manually. It has to be taken down manually. There just isn't the access to bring in heavy equipment, especially on the balconies. The balconies, the loading that they can take is incredibly low. It's actually one of the reasons why we've closed those balconies to the public, because if you end up with a family standing in one spot on that balcony, you're probably exceeding the load that it's able to take without causing damage. And all it takes is for someone to suddenly start jumping up and down, and that balcony could fail, which is why they haven't been open to the public for the last 10 years or so. It's certainly not strong enough to take a large team of people taking a heavy game head down using something like a small scaffold tower to the back. We had to approach it in different ways. This video actually shows how we would take down something like a hippo. And I'm not sure if the sound will work. If it doesn't, then I'll kind of let you know kind of what's going on. If it does, then you'll get an idea. But basically, the first thing that we always do when we're dealing with one of these sorts of objects is to talk about how we're going to do it. Because if you don't have a team of people who all understand exactly what's going on and have a very clear set of instructions, then basically you're asking for trouble. And the team I was working with on this project, and I've been working with them for the last 6 months or so, have been fantastic. And the guys from Morris Ward, different people on the team at different times, but everyone I've worked with has been absolutely brilliant. They're all just, they're really skilled. They're really good at what they do. Okay, I'm not sure if the sound is playing here, but basically we just talked about how we're going to lift it. We're going to move it away from the wall. The tension is taken up on the rope, and then basically we're going to drop it down. So this is a test lift to start with, and then we decided that actually felt all right. We're going to follow through with a full move, and basically we bring it down. And the idea is that you keep a lift as simple as possible. You don't try to go into kind of go taking it off someplace else. You drop it down as soon as you get it down, because otherwise people get injured. And the idea is to minimize the risk to the people and minimize the risk to the objects. Okay, so and we had to do that 170 odd times. So we had large objects like wapiti skulls, the North American red deer, the elk, and this kind of large chap on the right is Cape buffalo, and oh my god, those things are so heavy. This one's kind of, it probably weighs the same as I do. I weigh about 90 kilos. That's being generous. Probably 95 kilos at the moment. They're really, really heavy, really difficult to move. They're a nightmare. But we have to get these things down. So there is a certain amount of just brute strength involved, because in a historic museum space, you just don't have the kind of facilities that you want to have to be able to move things safely without having to use brute force. The other thing that we had to think about is not just getting them down, but getting them off site. So we spent a bit of time trying to plan the best way and the most efficient way to move a large number of these game heads, which have been suspended on pillars all around the building. And I was kind of coming up with quite complex designs, which would have been amazing, I'm sure, to use wheeled trolleys and so on. But in the end, we actually went with a very simple method. We basically attached them to boards. So we used some heavy boards, we screwed them in, we tied them off, and effectively they are secured in a way which they're designed to be secured in, because they're designed to be hung on a wall. That's how all of the structure on the back of them, and those plinth and the trophy mounts on the back, they're all designed to be hung on walls. So if you hang it to something and then secure it a bit more firmly using some cotton tape or whatever else, or galvo band, which is this kind of metal strip, then effectively you've got a really secure fixing. And then we wrapped those boards in plastic. And the reason we used plastic is because everything that comes out of this building, out of the Dead Zoo, has to go to our offsite storage building, which is out in Swords, just outside Dublin. And we have a huge storage facility there with these vast freezers. But the idea is that you have to wrap it in plastic before it goes in the freezer, because otherwise, as it freezes and then defrosts, you get a large amount of water forming, and you get a lot of damage to specimens from water. So you can't have that. So you have to wrap them really securely without any air holes before you put them into the freezer. We freeze at -30. And so moving them once they're wrapped is difficult because they're slippery. So we use a stretcher. We just put the whole board onto a stretcher, lift it into the back of the truck using, again, brute force and the stairs. And then we tie them off to the walls of the truck, and then they go out to our offsite storage facility. Over on the left-hand side here, you can see the large walk-in freezer. So this freezer is, it's the size of a kind of a container, shipping container. And you can get a large amount of material in there. And then once they've gone through the freezing cycle, so at -30, you only need to freeze it for a week to kill all the pests which would be brought over from the other building. We don't want any of those in the new space. So they come in, they get frozen, they go into the conservation room in that space, and they get cleaned, get the worst of the dust off, and certainly clean off any dead pests. And there are lots and lots and lots of pests coming from the dead zoo, because historic buildings are just full of things like moths and carpet beetles, and they're all eating the collections all the time. And frankly, the only thing that stops those collections from being completely decimated is arsenic. And this is one of the major issues in terms of health and safety, which we had to consider when dealing with all of the collections. So, we had to wear masks because of COVID. Obviously, we're doing all of this stuff while COVID's happening. But also, we have masks because we don't want to be breathing in arsenic. And it's a standard way of treating taxidermy. They'd make up an arsenical soap, or sometimes using mercuric chloride, and they'd kind of wash the inside of the skin of the animal with this arsenic-rich formula, and then basically they stitch it all up. And that's fine while the animal's in good condition, but as soon as it starts splitting and breaking, that's when you start getting arsenic coming out of it. So it's something you have to be really careful of. So we always wear face masks. There are filters, HEPA filters on the vacuum cleaners that we use to clean the dust off. We have extraction when we're cleaning them. And the idea is, when we're working on them directly in the museum space, to minimize our exposure to them by wearing PPE and masks and gloves and so on, and then to wrap them as soon as we can. Once everything's clean and kind of safe, it goes onto storage shelves, and you can kind of see here that we have shelves which have clean taxidermy over on the left-hand side, and shelves which have objects which are waiting to be cleaned on the right. They're still wrapped in plastic. And the idea is you don't want to leave them wrapped in plastic, because it creates a microclimate, which sometimes, if the air that is in that kind of wrapped bag is more humid than the surrounding air, then the relative humidity in the bag goes up. And if it's quite a warm space, or a reasonably warm space, then you can start having issues with things like mold growth, which is never good. And some of these objects, the smaller ones, we actually hang on mesh as well, because it's a really efficient way of storing these sorts of specimens, because that's what they're designed for. They're for hanging up. So we've got a large number of these game heads, and all the ones which are in the space that is going to be scaffolded have been moved. We've also protected all the glass in that space, because obviously it's a large amount of plate glass, and you can't have scaffold poles going through it. So we tried to make the space as safe as possible, and not just the kind of wall cases. But the main cases have been scaffolded out. So the guys from the OPW, which is the Office of Public Works in Ireland, the building management services guys, the carpenters in particular. So Brian is a legend in that, and there's Dan helping him. They built these actually very well made boxes around all of the cases which weren't being moved, which weren't being emptied, to make sure they're protected from falling debris and from dust and all the rest of it. And they did a really good job. And actually, in some places, they built platforms which were strong enough to actually use as working platforms. And that was really fantastic, because it meant that we only need to get a scaffold installed for the larger of our two whales. So the small one at the bottom there is a juvenile humpback whale, and the large one above it is a fin whale, which is 20 meters long. This is a huge animal. So what we've got here, this is where we're just about to start working on our humpback whale. We've got the working platform in place, and we've got a gantry in place. But unfortunately, that gantry couldn't be used until we managed to cut the first chain suspending the specimen, which caused no end of problems. But having the working platform was great, because it meant we were able to get access to Sylvia again, and she was able to get up there and clean the specimen, because it was completely covered in mold on the top surface because of the leaks from above. The people who are actually dismantling the specimens came over from the Netherlands. So it's a company called Inside Out Animals. And Michael, there on the right-hand side, is the guy who kind of runs that company. And he likes to work with kind of other skilled people. This is Jolene on the left. He worked with Karen for the fin whale and Jolene for the humpback whale. And they did a fantastic job. And Michael was really, really clear that he much prefers working with women on these jobs because they don't try to kind of be Rambo and try to like macho themselves into a position where they cause themselves harm. And I totally get where he's coming from because it's very easy to do that. And I wouldn't say that I've been guilty of that myself, but I have. So it was great to see the progress the guys made. Taking apart the specimens is quite a detailed project because you're not just taking apart like something like made out of timber, but you're taking apart a museum object. So every single thing has to be labeled, it has to be carefully looked after, it has to be carefully packed and wrapped, taken out of the building safely. And you know, you get a sense of scale. And this is me. I'm average height for a man in the UK and Ireland. I'm about 5'10" and a bit. The bit is really important. It gives you an idea of the size. This is the small whale. It gives you an idea of how big these things are. They really are, and they're heavy. That bone is really, really dense. Whales have dense bone in order to be able to have a bit of negative buoyancy so they can sink because they have a lot of fat in their bodies. And obviously when they breathe, they take in a big load of air. So their bones are dense to help them dive to go and feed. So they're really heavy. And this is that same flipper being carried down the stairs by the Morris Ward team. And again, it's you get an idea of the amount of work involved in protecting the objects as they move. So the skull, in order to get the gantry in, we had to kind of build this little mini gantry using timber, really good solid timber beams, and strap the whale skull to that and take the weight off the chain that was suspending it actually from the whale above. The chain that's holding that is going through the skeleton of the whale above it. We basically had to find a way of getting through the chain. In the end, we used bolt cutters, and it was a bit of a nightmare because we thought it would be a nice kind of modern steel chain. Actually, it was like wrought iron, and we had to chew our way through it. And of course, when you work in these conditions, we couldn't even high five each other because of COVID. We had to maintain that distance. And it's really hard when you're doing a project like this and you're getting excited about the first big kind of cut of the move and not being able to celebrate with your colleagues. It's one of the hardest parts of the project. But the project went really well. We managed to get the whale down. The skull was the last thing that was dropped. Weighs about a quarter of a ton, 250 kilos. And we dropped that down and basically, once it was down, we had to figure out how to get it out of the building. And that wasn't as straightforward as we originally hoped. We thought that because it was hanging from the ceiling, that it was actually going to be a fairly strong structure. But this is actually the sutures in the skull. This is where the front part of the skull meets the back part of the skull. And effectively, it's almost like fingers kind of linking into each other. And you can see that they're pulling apart here. So this part of the skull here should actually be flush with this part of the skull here. And this is actually very common in whales. And in our fin whale, it's completely fallen off, actually. So that part of the skull, we had to find a way of moving it and getting it out through a window without it falling apart. And so, again, the guys from Morris Wood did a really good job of building a framework which gave it support where it needed support, gave it strength where it needed strength, but also gave it enough kind of visibility and flexibility so that we weren't putting too much stress on a particular point of the bone and causing it to break. Because that's always a problem with a heavy object. It's putting weight from its own mass against whatever you're propping it against. And we had to counter that by spreading that weight over as larger area as possible so that you're not putting point loading in one small area. And the guys did an amazing job. They built this crate, this kind of little racing crate, as we refer to it, in order to be able to take the whale, so give it all the support it needed, but also to be small enough to get it out of the building. Unfortunately, it wasn't big enough. It was too big to go out the door, and it was too heavy to really carry down the stairs. The lower jaws went out fine, no problem. Upstairs, we had to make a hole in the window to do that. So we removed a window, and this is a scaffold platform over on the left-hand side that we built to actually make access to make a hole in the window, remove a whole kind of part of the building's wall there. And from that, we were able to winch out the skull. So this is the small humpback whale skull actually being winched down using a crane. And you can see from this why it's so important that that crate is strong. It's taking the weight of the crate itself. It's taking the stress from those straps, which are coming from the crane above. It's taking the weight of the skull itself. And it's also spreading that weight internally and bracing it and supporting it, so that as we do these moves, it's not kind of getting swung around and becoming loose. It's not kind of breaking because it's got too much weight on its side there as it's flipped over. So those are all the sorts of things that we had to take in mind, and it shows how well that crate was made, that we didn't even move 1 millimeter, and the distance in the sutures that were falling apart didn't move at all during that move, which is remarkable. We also used that to take out the walrus that we flipped out on its side, and that was a very, very tight squeeze out the window, and both of those managed to fit to a truck, and they went off to store, our off-site store, no problem at all. Our next big kind of part of the job was to finish preparing the space for the scaffolding, and the amount of work that went into that was absolutely monumental. We had scaffold designers. Georgina Malloy did an amazing job on that, and we had a structural engineer on site, and a lot of the time a guy called Mark Gill, who did an amazing job as well. He really understands the building and understands where you can and you can't put loads in the space, because the floor loading in a building like this it doesn't meet modern standards to any stretch of the imagination. That elephant standing on that plinth, the floor loading exceeds what you get in most modern buildings. The only reason why it's actually been able to stand where it is because it's right along a pillar line, and where the pillars are where the main structural beams in the building are. So it's the strongest point on the floor. So it meant that we weren't able to move things like that elephant because there was nowhere strong enough to put it in that space. So what we had to do is box it in, and here it is getting wrapped up in Tyvek before we then wrapped it in plastic and put in a timber frame around it to be able to seal the whole thing off and stop it from getting covered in dust. Immediately downstairs from that, we had to start fixing these timbers to the ceiling in order to be able to take acro props from the ground floor. So these props will be what's taking the weight from the scaffolding on that first floor and channeling that weight down without causing any damage to the floors, straight down into the floor below. So the idea is that you make a structure that's as stiff and strong as possible before you start putting in your large scaffolding. And when I say it's a large scaffolding, I mean it's monstrous, and we still have it, and it's an amazing platform to work on, but it is absolutely epic because it's got to take moving loads of around, that whale skeleton weighs about 3 tons. Then you have all of the gantries that are needed to support it while you're trying to move it, because we have to detach it from the ceiling. Then you've got all of the mobile scaffolding towers, which have to be used to get access to it. And then you have all of the people working. So you're dealing with really, really significant weights, and a lot of those weights are moving. So the scaffold has to be really, really solid, really secure, and really robust. And what we ended up was basically the most secure dance floor in Dublin. Probably it's incredible. You could park cars on that. It's absolutely brilliant. And the very first thing that we did is literally the day that they finished putting the scaffold platform in was to get cleaning. So our conservation team came in, they did an amazing job. It wasn't just Sylvia, it was some of the other members of the team as well. And so we had Karina and Lorna coming in and doing some work, and it was a fantastic opportunity to work with some of the other members of the National Museum of Ireland staff, because normally in natural history, it's a fairly small space. We tend not to have much going on because it's such a static historic building. So it's been really good to work with some of the members of our broader team. This is us trying to manhandle a large, a 90 kilos aluminium beam into place that will take the weight of the skull. It was the worst part of this entire project. It's just terrifying trying to move something that heavy over a specimen with glass directly above you, standing on top of a scaffold tower, standing on top of a scaffold platform. So you're up kind of, best part of 10 meters in the air. It's a bit surreal and enjoyable in some parts, but my God, that was the worst part of the entire project. But having that in place meant that the guys were able to come back over from the Netherlands. So this is Michael again, and in the background there, hiding behind that saw, you can see Karen, and Karen is actually based in Ireland. So she didn't come over from the Netherlands. She's actually coming over from the west coast of Ireland. She's an absolute legend. It's been great working with her and Michael, but because Karen's in Ireland, it means that we're able to kind of continue our working relationship. And she does a lot of work for the Irish Well and Dolphin Group, which are a fantastic group that the museum has a relationship with. We take samples of stranded whales from them. They take the samples on the beach and they send them on to us, and we look after them for them. And actually, myself and Karen are doing a talk for the Botanic Gardens, the National Botanic Gardens, at the end of March 31st, I think it is. So if you're interested in hearing more about the actual whale side of this whole project, then you can go and sign up for that. It's another free talk. And Karen will be talking about that as well, so it won't just be me yabbering on again. And taking down the whale, oh my God, it's one of those things that you don't really know what you're doing until you're doing it with these specimens, because they're suspended so far away from where you can access them. We thought that whale was mostly made of bone, and it turns out it wasn't. So the fingers of the flippers, I'll another one with me for scale. The very kind of the fingery bits of the flipper are all made of wood, and as are the kind of arm bones up there. The top part of the arm, the humerus here, is actually made of plaster. The only real bit of bone in the whole of that flipper is the shoulder blade, the scapula. And the reason why that is because this particular whale was died at sea, and actually it started decomposing. So those bones at the kind of extremities were starting to fall off, or they were getting so badly degraded from the products of decomposition that basically they weren't suitable for display. So we're not 100% sure whether they just got completely lost or if they were just completely unsuitable. But all of the tail, the flippers, and actually the front part of the skull, all of that had been kind of remade in either plaster or timber. And so this is Michael and Karen having taken apart the majority of the whale with just the skull left to do, which in itself was a huge undertaking, because we have no way of knowing how heavy these things are, and they can vary quite a lot in weight. But generally speaking, the skull of something like a fin whale weighs about a ton. The top part is actually not necessarily as heavy as the bottom part. So the bottom part of this skull was about 380 kilos. The top part turned out to be about half a ton. So it's still heavy. And you have to be really careful when you're working on it, because you never know which bits are going to break. So the lower jaw in this was largely made up of actual bone, which is relatively strong. But the front part was made of plaster, so that could fail at any time. So it's the kind of thing you have to be really cautious of. Getting it down was horrific, bit of a nightmare. How do okay. It was a bit of a nightmare, but we managed to get it down in one piece. And then we were faced with a bit of a problem, because that skull is very, very big, and we had to try to get it out through that little window. So before we even started taking the skull down, we actually had to start doing laser scans and getting measurements of exactly how wide that skull is, so that we could design a method for getting it out of the window and making sure that it would fit. And again, the guys from Morriswood did a fantastic job of building that. And you can kind of see that we had to lift the casters on this rolling frame up into the actual body of the frame. So there's a very, very small amount of clearance to make sure that we were able to get it out through the window and actually have enough space to be able to lift it all the way out of the building, because it's quite a complex process. And I was actually delighted with how easily this thing handled. So this is us taking it for a test drive. And what we thought was just going to be giving a little shove to see if the casters worked and if it was actually snagging up on things on the floor, turned into us actually moving it into its final position before it left the building. And that's with 3 people. That's half a ton. And the fact that it moved so well it speaks volumes about the craftsmanship that went into the actual building of the frame, and also the craftsmanship that went into the carpentry and the floors. The guys from the OPW did an amazing job making those floors suitable to be able to roll something with such small clearance. It's 4.5 meters long. It weighs half a ton. and we managed to squeeze it down through a very, very small space with 3 people easily. It was a real pleasure to move. So it's one of those, those parts of that project which really, really made me feel proud of the people that I was working with. It was just such a joy because it's not just a heavy object, it's also delicate. The front part of that skull is made largely of timber with a small piece of bone running down the middle. If you put too much weight in any one point of it, it would just fall apart, it would smash because there's so much weight in the object, and it's literally planks held together with a skim of plaster and a few nails. You can't put too much weight in any one place. You have to spread the load again. So here we're supporting from underneath, we're supporting from all sides as much as we possibly can, and we're actually suspending it from the top of the frame. And that timber frame proved to be absolutely spot on. We managed to maneuver it around really tight bends. And this was kind of the tightest point in the entire move because there's a danger of the far end falling off the edge of the platform. But we managed to get it round. That wasn't a problem in the end. And all of the careful planning that went into this project actually paid off. And it really felt like it paid off at this point, having moved that around there. The only other thing that had to be kind of done to make sure that it was going to work is to actually fit it out the window. And when we tried to get it out, it fitted perfectly. It was a smooth move, and that got hoisted off with no problems at all. Now, I haven't got a video. I do have videos of that, but I'm not going to show them to you because I don't want to spend any longer talking to you. I probably used up all my time. But just to summarise, the progress has been absolutely fantastic so far. We've moved and protected a large number of objects, including things like elephants, giraffes, hippos, rhinos. There's a lot of big stuff that's moved, and we've got some more moves to do with those later on. We've moved over 6,500 specimens. Now, they're not all large, most of them are quite small. There's a huge amount of work involved in moving them as well, actually. You have to really know what you're doing because they're really delicate. And I was going to talk more about those, but actually I didn't really feel like we had time. And but they shouldn't be underestimated because some of those objects are made of glass and are incredibly fragile. Some of the objects are things in jars, and you have to be really careful when you're moving them because the fluid that they're in transmits kind of waves of energy as it moves and smash the objects apart. And also, they contain chemicals which are flammable and some of them are toxic. So you have to be really, really cautious when you're doing these moves. We've also moved so far 176 game heads, and of course the 2 whales hanging from the roof. And so a huge number of people have been involved in this project. I can't thank everybody, but people who have been really heavily involved. Emma Jane at the OPW has been largely responsible for organising people, the scaffolders, getting in things like the gantries. She's done a vast amount of work. And Derek McCormick on the OPW on the Building Management Services side has been absolutely fantastic. He's been so helpful. To be honest, I can honestly say all of the people I've worked with on this project have been absolutely wonderful, and there's no way we could have done it without them. Unfortunately, we did have to do this project without one person, and that was our colleague and good friend, Matthew Parks, who sadly passed away in October of last year. And he was there at the very beginning of the project to help us take down some of the game heads, and sadly, he wasn't there for the rest of the project. And he'll be sorely missed. We miss him every day, and I think about him every day, and it's a real shame that he's not able to see the incredible progress we've made so far. And it's even worse that he won't see when we finally got a new roof and the building is looking much more the way it should do. Thanks very much, everybody.
Magnificent. Thank you, Paolo. I think I wonder if I can just momentarily unmute everybody so that oh no, I can't. Yeah, it's all too complicated. So we can hear your applause, but I think I have to ask everybody to unmute themselves, which is just too much of a hassle. That's absolutely magnificent, Paolo. Oh, I should put my camera on.
Hey, Sally.
Right. Hey.
I'm getting to see people's names popping up. Even if I can't see the people, I can see their names, which is nice.
Which is wonderful. Well, first of all, Paolo, I'll raise a drink to your friend and colleague.
To Matthew.
To Matthew. Absolutely wonderful. I mean, you were saying you were worried you were going to run over your time. I mean, could have listened for another half hour at least. Absolutely brilliant. We've got, I think, just one question so far in the chat,
Oh yeah, give us
and
your questions.
I can see people clapping. I put the Eventbrite link for your event at Botanic Gardens. Having a whale of a time at
Thanks for that.
Dublin's Dead Zoo online. Is that the one?
That's the one.
Okay, brilliant. I
Fantastic.
imagine it'll be
Thanks for
nothing
that.
like this one, so it's definitely worth tuning in, tuning for that.
Yeah,
Well,
it will
at
actually be
least,
quite different.
well, not least in terms of the technical competence.
I didn't want to
So
say anything, but
yeah, yeah, yeah.
we had a few issues, but it's
Paolo,
good.
if
It's
you
good.
just want to, sort of take a quick breather, I will explain what happens next, and then we'll come back for questions. So obviously, that's the end of the first part, and thank you so much again, Paolo. It's a delight and a privilege to have you kicking off the new season of the rebirth of PubSci online, and I really mean that.
It's been a pleasure to be back here.
It's good to have you, man. Anyway,
Good to
enough of
see
this
you.
loving. So apologies to those who had trouble joining. I know there was at least one person that joined fairly late in the event. For some reason, Zoom generated a bogus link. Told you that we were in another meeting. In fact, we were in this meeting. Hopefully, you all worked out that the original meeting ID and passcode were correct. I have no idea how that happened, and I so nearly didn't include that short link in the emails. And I now really wish I'd listened to my better judgment on that. I'm just going to pause or rather stop the YouTube video. Actually, no, I'll leave the YouTube video running because people might want to see the questions. One thing I've noticed is that even though the YouTube runs 20 seconds behind, it cuts off as soon as I end it here. But if anybody did miss the beginning of the talk or just wants to see it again, you can go to our YouTube channel, the PubSci YouTube channel, and you've got it in your emails, and you can find it on the PubSci website. And you will see a talk from last June. You will see in a little while Paolo's talk, and there will be a library of future talks appearing. Now, PubSci website, hopefully you all know, is www.pubsci.info. Not .org, not .biz, not .com or .co.uk. It's .info. I will put that in the chat. When you go to the PubSci website, you will see that we have a little future events calendar where you can see what's coming up, and I can give you a little preview of that now. We've moved from the first Wednesday of the month to the last Friday for the time being. That was just kind of the way it went, but seeing as nobody's going out on a Friday, it seems reasonable to keep it that way until that changes. We can all hope that maybe come July, the last Friday of the month might be an occasion for being somewhere other than in front of a computer, in which case we will definitely think about changing our day. But for March, we have Dr. Erica McAllister, another long time PubSci alumnus, great friend of Paolo and myself, works at the National History Museum. She is at Fly Lady NHM.
Fly Girl.
And
NHM.
Fly Girl. Oh, yes, Fly Girl. Thank you, NHM. She's published 2 books on flies, and the second one came out last year. It's called The Inside Out of Flies, and she's going to be talking about that. But knowing Erica, she'll just talk about whatever is most fascinating, gruesome, and entertaining about flies.
She'll talk about their genitals. That's what she always talks about.
She will talk about the genitals. I'm glad you mentioned that. So I was going to say, kids love her talks, and parents love her talks. But whether it's actually suitable for children or not, I don't know. I mean, on the whole, we meet in a pub, so that's never an issue. April is yet to be confirmed. May, we have Naomi Rogurney, who is a final year PhD student working on the on gas sorry, the ice giants, and she's been involved with NASA's James Webb Space Telescope, which is set to essentially overtake Hubble. It's an infrared telescope, and it is going to be capable of seeing back in time to the very birth of stars and galaxies. So she'll be able to talk about that and the ice giants. And Paolo, if you there you go. Paolo has the is that the Inside Out or the Secret Life? That's the first one, the Secret Life of Flies. Lovely, which is Erica's first book. Normally, of course, we'd be in a pub and she'd bring some books and we'd sign them, but we will try and at least get a link where you can buy them from your local bookseller. That's maybe not necessarily a large multinational corporation that may or may not pay its taxes in the country in which it does business. I say no more. Anyway, so yes, They Might Be Gas Giants is on the last Friday of May. And then in June, we have Dr. Michael Byford, again, another long-time friend. And he's a virologist. And so he's going to be looking at the science of viruses, pandemics, and vaccines. And to be honest, the end of June seems the perfect time to be doing that. Now, of course, you weren't taking notes, and why should you? Which is why you should go to pubsci.info, look at our future events calendar. You can also sign up to our Google Calendar. You can subscribe to our Google Calendar. As soon as events are announced, they will appear in your calendar or diary app. And we also have a Facebook page. Just look for PubSci on Facebook. We're also on Twitter at PUBSCI. And on the website, you can also subscribe for a monthly email. It's roughly monthly. You might get a few more, you might get a few less. It was quiet for a few months, and then obviously a couple went out before this one. But we don't bombard you with anything at all. We just let you know what's happening. And there's also some information there on how to join PubSci online. And I think the best advice is definitely going to be ignore the instant link that Zoom provides. I don't know what went wrong there, and I can only heartily apologize. Now, we've got some people watching on YouTube. I think there are a few there, but I don't think any questions have been submitted. So, Paolo, we did have one question. I don't know. Do we want to switch videos on now? It's a bit hard.
I think there are actually quite a lot more questions now.
Oh, are there?
I think there are more questions.
Scrolling down.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think the only question earlier on was from Becky. Why freeze and store at 30 degrees C? So if you want to take the ones that we've seen later on, but maybe start with that one.
Yeah, so the reason we freeze at -30 is insects have particular life cycles, obviously, and most of them are actually fairly resistant to the cold. So if you freeze at -18, which is the temperature that a normal freezer gets down to, there are quite a few insects which have the insects themselves will probably die, but their eggs tend to survive. So if you freeze at -18, it won't kill the eggs of things like clothes moths and carpet beetles. So what we do is we freeze at -30 because that will actually kill the eggs of those species. If we're freezing at -18, we have to do it for much longer. So there's basically desiccation as part of the kind of killing mechanism for the insects. And also one of the things that kind of used to happen, we tend not to do it now because I think the evidence suggests that you don't need to, you freeze at -18 for a week, and then you let it get back up to temperature so that the eggs then hatch, and then you freeze it again before the hatched eggs of the larvae that come out are able to actually kind of become adult and reproduce again. So It's one of those things where there's always a bit of discussion around it, but generally speaking, we freeze at -30 for any objects which are able to take it. So the big game heads, they're actually quite well buffered by, although they contain things like plaster, which you don't, it's not great freezing plaster because if it gets any moisture into it, that can crack it. But what we tend to do is, because it's so well buffered by the hair and the fur, and because we keep it in a sealed plastic bag, which acts also as an environmental buffer, it means that it's able to be frozen and it doesn't really cause any problems. So all it does is make sure that we can kill those bloody pests, because they are a nightmare. They are everywhere in the museum, in the Dead Zoo. They're endemic. We probably have our own species of bloody carpet beetles. They've been around for so long. So, we really do have problems there because it's an old building, and old buildings are full of holes, and so everything can get in. It's a nightmare. I hope that answers the question.
I'm just copying out the questions for you, Paolo. Have a little browse. So, Warthog Watts says these are some of the most fabulous taxidermy specimens I have seen, including a thylacine and, he believes, a pygmy hog. Thylacine. I mean, maybe you should mention what the thylacine is for those who don't know.
Yeah, I think everyone knows it. Everyone knows what a thylacine is.
I don't think everybody knows.
Okay, so the thylacine is.
No, everybody's been.
It's a species of marsupial, which is it's actually a really cool animal because it's a really good example of convergent evolution. It looks just like a dog, or a wolf.
You say?
But they are, well, they're extinct. I mean, they are extinct. They're quite definitely extinct. Even though someone apparently had great trail cam footage the other day of a live one. Yeah.
Or are they?
Yeah, no. Unfortunately, they are very much gone. It's sad. It is sad. And again, humans are responsible. The last one that is kind of recorded, they probably lived in the wild for a bit longer, but the last one that kind of we know about for sure, when it died in 1936 in Hobart Zoo. There were probably a few left in the wild after that, for a few years, but the population, the carnivores, they just didn't last very long. They were in Australia. They were outcompeted by dingoes, or by dogs that were introduced by humans about 40,000 years ago. So they've been gone from Australia for a very long time. But in Tasmania, they went extinct in 1936.
Right. Shall I just feed the questions to you because I've been copying
them
out.
Just shoot me in my direction.
Might be easier. Okay, so that was the thylacines. Goat Lips has asked about the documentary film. I think we can maybe show that at the end. It sounds like the audio was working from your end. I just couldn't get audio on my videos, so maybe we could do that just when we close off.
Okay, I'll see if I can find it because I don't have it on my computer. I have it on my phone, so I can find it on my phone.
I mean, I can send you the link.
Oh yeah, send me the link. That would be great.
I've got it on mine. Okay, let's do that. Got that lined up. Sam, hello, Sam. Sam's one of the PubSci gang. Regarding those historic glass panels, would you ever consider replacing those with newer, safer paints, or is the idea of getting rid of the originals too scandalous?
It's actually a discussion I've been having recently. The idea isn't scandalous because it's a safety issue. So basically, safety always trumps pretty much everything else, as it should do, because we don't want anyone to die. And that can happen with this plate glass. So the main issue actually is cost, because we have so much glass in that building. It's terrifying. And to replace it all would be, we would love to be able to replace it all, but it would be a horrific amount of money to do so. We're talking about more money than it would take to replace the roof, probably, because there is so much glass in there, and it's all fitted in these mahogany cabinets. So in order to remove the glass, you then have to do work on mahogany cabinets, which means you need to get in really skilled furniture conservators in order to do the work. And although we have some on staff, we've got a great guy called Patrick Boyle, fantastic, but there's one person, and there's way too much for one person to do if they want to do anything else with the rest of their time for the next 10 years. So effectively, while we would love to replace that glass, but we can't afford it. But what we will probably look at doing is, what we can't replace, we will probably try to get covered with film, a protective film, so that if the glass breaks, it's not going to become a load of fragments and shards, which will then cause damage. And that's the same thing that we do at the Horniman Museum, actually. So just when I arrived at the Horniman, 15, how long ago was that? 10 years? 15 years? I can't remember. 2007. Jesus, it's a long time ago. Anyway, when I arrived at the Horniman, we'd had a problem with the glass case getting broken. No one was hurt or anything, so that's fine. But what it did was alert us to the fact that this glass really doesn't break in a way which is friendly for people or objects or anything. It's just nasty. It's like literally forms these big razor sharp spears. And so we kind of got we did some fundraising. We found a source of funding. We got the money, and we basically coated everything with plastic like film on the inside, and so or on the outside. So actually, just after around the time I left the Horniman, about 9 years later, we actually had an incident where an adult with learning disability they had something which caused them to have a bit of an episode. They punched the glass, and although it broke and although it had to be replaced, they were uninjured. The specimens in the case weren't damaged, and there was none of that catastrophic failure of the glass that you had first time. So that is a really good illustration of why it's important to do those sorts of things. You can't necessarily replace everything, but you can make it safer. So that's definitely kind of high on our list of priorities, because the problem with inheriting old buildings is that you inherit problems that you don't necessarily even know are problems until they become a problem. And that's certainly in the Natural History Museum here at the Dead Zoo. That's a major issue, because we've had the balconies closed for the last kind of 11 years or so, after we had a major incident with the staircase collapsing. And you still get people saying, oh, no one ever fell off that balcony because the level of the railing is too low. It's so low that I can sit on it without having to actually like go up. I have to sit down onto it. If I hit that with any sort of speed, I'd fall over it. It's just not safe. The fact that no one has fallen off it is luck, not because it's well designed. And it's only a problem when it becomes a problem. And if you don't plan for when it becomes a problem, you're not doing your job properly. And so really in the museum, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure that it's a safe environment for people. There are kids running around all over the place in there. We don't want them getting injured. No one wants that. So anyway, that's a very long answer to a short question.
Risk analyses and planning for what could go wrong rather than what you hope might go right. What an extraordinary concept, Paolo. I can think of a few people in politics that could perhaps learn from that. Brilliant. So we've got 3 or 4 questions that are fairly similar, so I will roll them all together. From Deborah, amazing project. Problem solving and teamwork must have been satisfying. Will everything go back on display, and how long do you think it will take? Remert Schoten, I hope that's the correct pronunciation of your surname, Remert. What are the next steps in this project? Ronan Bergin, how long until the whole project is completed? And Lisa Wallage, when is the restoration work likely to be completed? Definitely wanting to visit in the future. So project planning and teamwork. Next steps, when's it going to be ready?
Oh, when's it going to be ready? So how long is a piece of string? I think is the answer to that. No, basically, we have a lot of plans in place. And the trouble is that all of our plans this year have been completely scuppered by COVID. So it makes things very difficult to plan because you don't quite know what's coming up next and when you're next going to get a set of restrictions. Ideally, what we're going to do is, this is very much a phased development. So the roof has to be replaced. It's an absolute, it's essential because it's raining in the space. We have to get a new roof. It's as simple as that. That's just actually the first phase of what we hope will become a much bigger project. And there are good indications that we may be able to actually develop a much bigger project to fix a load of other problems with the building. So one of our major issues, as I said just a minute ago, that the balcony levels have been closed to the public because they're just not safe. What we would like to do is to get them reinforced and to improve the fall protection on those balconies so that we can reopen them to the public. We have things like dodos and solitaires and Labrador ducks and all these extinct bird species. They're absolutely, they're incredible. We want people to be able to see them. They're all sitting up there and people can't get access to them. And we don't want it to be that way. That's just the way it is. And it is for genuine safety reasons, because we don't want anyone to get hurt. What we want to be able to do is to do the work that's required to make it safe, and then we can open up again. So that is very much our plan. But that is kind of obviously a much bigger job than getting a new roof. A new roof might cost 5 million. Completely redoing the building so it's accessible and it's safe. That's going to involve installing things like lifts and designing the building in a way which is, we don't want to change the look and feel of the building. We want to keep that historic feel because, it's really part of the Dead Zoo. It's why the Dead Zoo is so well loved. We don't want it to change, not in a way which is negative. And so to do that, we could be looking at a project which is anything from kind of 15 to 50 million. You just don't know how much it's going to cost until you get designs, you get planning, you get the architects involved. But at the moment we're developing a business case, and what we're hoping to do is to push that forward, take it to the government, and see if the department that's responsible for the museum will be able to support us in developing the building. And they seem to be really on side, so we're really hopeful that they will. And if that happens, then that obviously changes all the timelines. But the short answer again is, if all goes to plan, we will hopefully be able to reopen some of the spaces in the Dead Zoo, maybe from the late summer, but again, that will depend on COVID. It will depend on a lot of issues about getting kind of the protections put in place for the roof to make sure that we are able to open safely to the public while some of that roof work is actually taking place. If there are any problems with the safety factors, obviously, we can't stay open in a building site that isn't safe. So it will be when the roof gets replaced, which will take a little bit longer. But at the moment, we're hoping for late summer. We will see how that goes. I think mainly COVID is the thing that's going to cause a problem with that, because with restrictions in place, we can't work while we're not allowed to work. So until things change, we are sitting on our hands.
Wonderful. And another question from Ronan, and I suspect that's a question that a lot of people would have been wondering. You talked about things that weren't damaged, which might have been damaged. I'm not sure you ever specifically said whether anything was damaged. And while Ronan's question was anything damaged, my inclination is to ask how many artifacts were damaged and how badly. Perhaps I'm being pessimistic and unfair on Inside Out Zoo.
Remarkably, the only damage that we really got was deliberate. There was no accidental damage done to anything that I'm aware of. It's one of those things you can never be 100% sure, because you can't see exactly what happens to every single thing in every single box. But from everything that's been unpacked at the other end, I've had no reports of any damage. The only things which were damaged were the whales, and the only bits of the whales that were damaged were the ones which basically had to be damaged in order to be able to get them down. So in the case of the humpback whale, that actually wasn't very much stuff, because the way which it's been put together was actually relatively easy to take apart. So in fact, the more I think about it, I don't think I think there was one small bit of bone damaged when we took the lower jaw off the humpback whale. And that was a calculated risk, and it was a very small piece of bone. It wasn't much. The fin whale, because it had been kind of rebuilt quite extensively from things like plaster and so on, and they'd actually put the plaster directly onto the steel armature of the whale. All of that kind of like rebuilding work had to be undone because of the way in which they'd done it. So we literally were in there with a saw. Well, I say we, I wasn't me, it was Michael and Karen. We're in there with hammers and chisels and saws, and it was a case of just cutting through and trying to do the minimum amount of damage required, to to allow you to actually do the job. So there's a fair bit of work to be done to put all of those bits of the firmware back together, but actually because of the way in which the damage was carried out, it's all relatively easily fixed. So apart from that, I'm not aware of anything. We've moved eggs, we've moved insects with incredibly fragile legs, we've moved glass Blaschka models, which are these incredible delicate structures. So far, again, I'm going to touch wood here, as far as I'm aware, none of those things received any damage, because basically the team of people that I'm working with are incredibly professional and good at their jobs. It's just that's the way in which we work in the museum world, and that's why it takes time and effort and thought and consideration and planning to do everything that we do, because we don't want to break things.
That's quite remarkable. I mean, I must admit, when I saw the saw up by the whale vertebrae, I kind of had a moment of panic, and then I saw the white plaster, and you started talking about it. So how much has to be remade?
So the tip of the tail was all made of plaster. Now, we may reuse all of the bits from that. They just have to be put back together again. So they've been sawn. Actually, sawing something gives you a nice clean cut, which is relatively easy to fix. There'll be a bit of touching up work. Might need some Japanese tissue to cover some of the kind of more splintery breaks where you've had other materials, because where you have plaster, you actually usually have people putting other things in there, bits of fabric, cloth, whatever else, bits of wood, all sorts of stuff went into that plaster to help bulk it out, and also to give it a bit of structural stability, because plaster is hard, but it's also quite brittle. And so you include things like paper or fabric, whatever, to strengthen it. And so, where you have tears of that kind of material, you'll get breaks in the plaster which are harder to repair just using kind of modern techniques. So there are ways of doing that using Japanese tissue, and to be honest, I know a lot of conservators who would be really good at doing that kind of stuff, and I just hope we can get some of them on board to do the repairs.
Well, for sure. So let me see where we are with the questions. William Vine says, Paolo, good to see you again. Fantastic achievement.
Good to see you, William.
To what extent will you be adapting the building to accommodate the loads and stresses you have mitigated in the move?
That's a great question, because largely that will fall to not me. Basically, if it's not an object, it's not my problem. That's not entirely true, because I've been project managing this, so all of these things have been my problem. But Mark Gill is the structural engineer who has been working on this project with us, and he's worked on other things in the museum as well. He knows it inside out, and he will be the person who'll be giving us advice about what needs to happen. I hope we'll be getting new floors both on the ground floor and the first floor, because those floors, they're not very strong anymore. They never were that strong. They were never strong enough for all the stuff they put on them. The fact that it lasted as long as they have done is great. We have issues with like objects being vibrated off the shelf that they're sitting on because of the vibration traveling through the floor. That tells us that the floor loading is way too high, and that the floors are really overly sensitive to small levels of vibration. So we know for a fact that they need to be fixed. Now, how they're fixed is kind of not my problem, because I'm not a structural engineer and I'm not an architect. But the architects we have working on the project, we have a few architects who have been involved in the project, and all of them have been absolutely fantastic. Tomas and Emma Jane and Hilary, they all understand the building. They've all taken a lot of time and effort talking to us and to understand the kind of context of the building and the history of the building. And then obviously they've got their architects' heads on, their conservation architects. So they really have a good understanding of the details of how these things are put together. And between them and Mark, I think we'll come up with a really, a solid solution for sorting out that floor loading issue. I certainly hope so, because frankly, I haven't got a clue.
Excellent. And I think it's a linked question, really, from Also from William, do museums now keep records of how exhibits are installed to manage maintenance, presumably removal, in the distant future?
Yes, it's a sensible thing to do. If you're not doing it, you bloody well should.
That makes perfect sense.
It's difficult when these things were installed so long ago. That's our main problem.
Yes, quite. Okay, and last one from William on this list: are arsenic and mercuric chloride still used, or are the modern equivalents, and are they as effective? I mean, I think this is quite a problem, isn't it?
Well,
At both ends.
in theory, arsenic is no longer used. In practice, I know taxidermists who are absolutely, who would never use arsenic because they want their stuff to be usable by people, but they do know people who still use arsenic. So it hasn't gone away, and the reason why people still use it is because it works. There is no modern alternative. Modern alternative is what we call IPM, integrated pest management. And that's just about making sure that you reduce the risks of that object getting infested in the first place, by managing how people kind of behave in the space and managing things like the climate, the humidity, all of the kind of issues that lead to pest infestation can be managed different ways. But the long and short of it is, and you also monitor all the time to see if you have a problem. If you have a problem, you treat it using freezing. But we just don't rely on the chemical solutions that we used to, because basically most of them are banned, most of them are illegal, most of them are not available anymore. So, it is simultaneously the biggest problem that we face as curators of natural history collections tends to be pests, and either managing modern pests and kind of dealing with them when we find them, or dealing with the ways in which other people in the past have dealt with them. And those are our biggest headaches all the time. And if you're a preventative conservator, that's going to escalate it to an even higher level because it's even more of your job. At least I have the opportunity to go away and look at something in a very different light, but it's a nightmare. Pests are a nightmare, and there is no simple way of dealing with them.
And don't lick your fingers when you're handling old
Don't lick the taxidermy. The first rule of museums is do not lick the taxidermy.
They should actually put that on the entrance, shouldn't they? Keep hold of your children and don't lick the taxidermy.
That's what I say. Do Heather, not touch the object.
Yeah, makes good sense. Heather, who is I don't know if I can say you are a taxidermist. You have done taxidermy, I know, and Kirsten as well. Heather makes the point that it uses borax on the inside of the skin to manage decay, but it won't stop case moth. And I have enough problems with clothes moths. And borax tastes nasty too. Okay, so Kirsten has licked borax. I've not. I've used it, but I've not licked it. Also very handy to make into a spray to spray anything that has woodworm, active woodworm, by the way. Yeah, it specifically says don't eat borax. Anyway, leaving that aside, there's a comment from Warthog Wox again. Padamelons. Warthog, you seem to be quite preoccupied with marsupials. Padamelons are sort of these cute, sort of they're like baby sort of wallabies or something to the untrained eye. They've got certain cuteness about them. But you did make the comment that you'd not heard of PubSci before and you heard about it through somebody else. So thank you very much. Do please spread the word, by the way. We have been quiet or dark, as they say in the theatre world, for some time. So, it's great to get people involved from all walks of life. And every talk, though not the same, will be as fascinating as Paolo's in different ways. And yeah, we have sort of fly anatomy coming up. We have cosmology and space science coming up. We have virology coming up. We will hopefully be having a talk that was postponed due to the coronavirus pandemic in the early days about science communication on the BBC. which may well have got a lot of us who are sort of over 40 into our love of science. Now the question, Carl and Leslie and Carl Thurston Brown, who are in Canada. Hello. It's early for you, isn't it? Yeah, it's not late. Okay. What percentage of your collection is extinct species? And I mean, you mentioned quite a few of them, and you're quite certain that the thylacine is extinct, which will disappoint the cryptozoologists everywhere. We'll probably get letters written in to PubSci Towers about that.
Yeah. We have a lot of extinct stuff because it's an old collection. So, I mean, obviously, in terms of proportion of the collection, it won't be big because, you know, in terms of the proportion of animals alive today in a zoology, this is a zoology museum, not our kind of paleontology or geology museum. So, although we have some Irish deer, generally, it's fairly low on the paleontology in the Dead Zoo exhibition space. Our collection of geology and paleontology is absolutely brilliant. We've got some incredible stuff. But that's a whole different ballpark. We'll talk about that another time. In terms of kind of recently extinct, i.e. in terms of while humans were kicking around, I'd say less than 1% of the collection. We've got 2 million objects, and just off the top of my head, the extinct stuff, you know, we've got things like huias, and we've got the Labrador duck, we've got the Auckland merganser, we've got the dodo, we've got the Rodriguez solitaire, we've got the passenger pigeon, we've got the thylacine, we've got the Pyrenean ibex, we've got, and those are ones which are on display, and me just thinking of the ones which I've like physically touched recently. And then we've got all the stuff behind the scenes in storage, which I've not, like, I don't remember them because I've not touched them, but I know there's loads of stuff, which is, Eskimo curlews, oh God, yeah. So we have a lot of stuff because it's an old collection. You know, it's what happens with old collections. We first started, the collection in the museum started for the first objects were acquired in 1792, and those objects themselves were taken from older collections. They were acquired as a purchase from an older collection. So the oldest things in our collection were collected when America was literally being founded. You know, it goes back that far in terms of things which were actively being collected by people. You know, and obviously we have loads of things which are way older than that because they're fossils or subfossil or whatever. Subfossil is not a thing. Don't say subfossil. They're fossils. It's either a fossil or it's not.
Dear PubSci. Well, of course, when you say you've touched and not touched the specimens lately, obviously you've not been licking your fingers afterwards because we've made that perfectly clear.
Don't do that. Don't do it.
Don't do that. Don't lick the specimens. You are currently at the Dead Zoo, which is a spectacularly old school zoo museum. You were formerly at the Horniman, which is also very much that old school feel. What is the attraction to you about this style of natural history museum? Of which there are, I mean, a few, but a relatively limited number.
There's a relatively limited number. To be honest, for me, that's a good question, actually. I've never really interrogated that in detail. I think it's partly because I'm an old-fashioned boy at heart.
That's it. You're just an old-fashioned boy at heart.
I don't know. I mean, my favourite museum in the world is in Paris. It's the Comparative Anatomy Museum in Paris. It's just the most beautiful, the most stunning place I've ever been, because it's got an army of skeletons just stretching forever. It's incredible. I could literally spend the rest of my life just walking around it looking at stuff. The Dead Zoo is my second favorite museum because it has that sense of history, that immersion in the past. And you know, it's not about, I think at the moment it's quite interesting because decolonization in museums is a massive topic, really important as well. It's something which I'm on the NATSC committee, and we do our best to try to kind of explore issues of decolonization in museums, because it's a really important thing for us to take into consideration, because we are fed a line about the way in which history works by kind of society, and usually it's bullshit. You don't hear the stories of marginalized people. You don't hear the stories of, most of the time, stuff collected by these kind of famous collectors isn't collected by them. It's collected by a native who from the country they've just like turned up in, who went and collected this thing and gave it to them. And they get no recognition. They get no, these things which we think of as being kind of like groundbreaking discoveries are known by local people for forever, and there's this massive problem with kind of colonization. But the trouble is that as soon as you take those same objects, those objects which were collected in a colonial setting, and you put them in a modern museum, you basically completely strip away the story of where they came from. And for me, I think that's why a historic setting is actually a good thing, because it contextualizes. It basically says, this is the product of colonialization. This is the product of empire. This is the product of going out and basically taking shit from other people, stealing other people's stuff. And in the case of natural history, it's less stealing other people's stuff. It's more, destroying other people's, native wildlife. But that's what it is. And I think if you remove the historical context of that, and put it into a nice shiny kind of glass, beautiful like shopping mall type setting, what you're actually doing is removing that context to such a point that people don't think about it at all. And I think at least in historical context, we can look at it and say, this comes with burdens, it comes with problems, it comes with issues, it comes with things that we need to consider. It's like, I think this looks beautiful. This is an amazing space, and all this mahogany, all of this glass, and all of these incredible animals. They are, evocative of something. But what they're evocative of is something that we have to challenge, and you can't challenge it if you're not being if it's not evocative. And for me, that's why I have a much deeper sense of connection with these kind of historic museum spaces than I do with modern museum spaces. I think it's because it actually ties it into an era, and it ties it into a kind of almost a mentality of collecting, which I think has to be challenged, but also has to be appreciated. There's very much a dichotomy there. There are problems, but there are also we are where we are because of what we've learned from this process. So we have to understand that it has its problems, but we also have to understand that that's where we came from, and that's good and bad. And for me, it's that complexity which is actually really interesting. And I'd never really thought about it before, and I'm glad that question was asked, because I'd never thought about it before, and now I think about it, I think I know where I'm coming from, and that's a good thing.
That's a great thing, and that's a really interesting answer, because it is so, as you just say, well, they look better, which may be true. We love the architecture, we love the diversity, we love that kind of sense of this sort of Victorian or pre-Victorian kind of immersion in a world of animals and bones and so forth. And yet I think what you've added there is really, really powerful, that there's a context, and rather than the historic context being one that negates the story, it's the gateway to the story, essentially.
Absolutely, yeah.
But this is not that talk, unfortunately. I mean, perhaps that could be another talk at another time. How do you do that? How do you sort of decolonialize while being aware of all the dimensions.
Well, I would say that there is actually a whole bunch of videos from a decolonisation conference that NATSCA held at the end of last year, in November last year, and it's all available on YouTube. So if people look up the NATSCA YouTube channel, there's actually some really interesting discussions about this exact topic.
And that's the NASCA is the National Society.
The Natural Science Collections Association. The Natural Sciences Collections Association.
Right. Yeah. Which is in your biog, so I should know the abbreviation. But I've had
just to add, another answer to the question is also that I appreciate the fact that you have this historical link. In the case of the Dead Zoo, the historic collections and that historic space also links people to their past. So there's an actor, Tom Hickey. He was in Moon Boy. He was the grandfather of Moon Boy. Yeah, really nice guy. He came to the museum one time. He has dementia. He's kind of getting on, and his memory is kind of one of the issues. Which is associated with dementia. It lost memory loss. And he came in and for some photo shoot for some kind of cultural thing, and which is nice. But the first thing he asked when I spoke to him was if we still had the hair, which is a hair that he had a photograph taken with him and the hair taken back in like the 80s. And he just, the first thing he asked me was do you still have the hair? And I took him down and showed him the hair, and it was in the same place. It wasn't actually in the same place, but it was very close to the same place. It felt like the same place, and he was able to reconnect with it. And for him, that was a really important and emotional thing to do, because when you have problems with your memory and your ability to recall things, having a place like the Dead Zoo where things don't change much is actually quite wonderful, because it immerses you in a place where your memory feels like it's coming to life, because it's the same, or it feels pretty much exactly the same as it did when you were a kid, when you used to visit. And for me, I think that's another part of why the museum that I currently work in, I love it so much, because the people that come there have been coming for generations. They've been coming since they were kids, and that connection to their past and the past of their family is really strong. And I think that's a wonderful and important thing, and that's why I would never want to change the feel or the shape of the atmosphere in that place. I think it is absolutely essential to keep that. Anyway, those
got some interesting. That's right. Got some interesting comments coming in apropos that. And I was wondering also whether it basically smells like it did when you were a kid as well.
Yeah.
The smell of museums is very evocative, and we know that's one of the that's one of the things, like music, which can evoke very strong, almost visceral connections to memories. So I mean, apropos that, Kate, I have seen your questions. I will get back to them. A couple of comments, from Sean Harris. Do you think the Dead Zoo's connection to the people of the city in which it sits is unique? I mean, it certainly, if it's not unique, there is a relationship which might be worth exploring between a city and its zoos. And he later adds, it's a memory map for people of Dublin.
Absolutely. As I was just kind of ranting about, it's one of those fixed points for the people of Dublin. It's always been there. It is relatively, it's pretty much unchanged, and the amount of, it's really hard to put into words how important that space is for so many people. I genuinely think that. I think that's quite unique. I think maybe the people in kind of Ipswich who have a similar sort of museum that hasn't changed for a very, very long time might have a similar feel. But it's like if you go to the Natural History Museum in London, I have kind of strong connections with that, because that's where I used to go when I was a kid. My mum used to take me there, and it's a wonderful place. It's part of what inspired me to become passionate about museums. And if you go there now, Dippy's gone. And if you were kind of a couple of generations ago, the elephant has gone and been replaced with this dinosaur. So because it's it changes. It doesn't change much. It doesn't change rapidly. But because change is something which has happened there, those kind of connections to the past do get severed when that happens. And so I think it makes it less kind of personal. Because when change happens, you feel kind of disenfranchised because you have no say in that change in something that you were passionate about before. And I think that's that's a shame. And that's something that I hope we don't find happening with Dead Zoo. I really hope that we're able, if any change does happen, it will be in response to people rather than despite people.
Excellent. So Kate says, is there a satellite museum that could be used to display some of the specimens that are currently in storage until the work is complete? And I'll also throw Katie O'Dwyer's comment or question. In the light of the discussion, I wonder what will be the record of current natural history going forward. Are we preserving much of our current biodiversity in order to have the future collections representative of this era? They're totally separate questions, but I thought I'd give you a couple to work with.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay. So what was the first one again?
First one was
I've
satellite
been drinking
site.
wine. I've had a bottle of wine already.
Yay, good for you. Well, it is PubSci.
It is PubSci. Can I get my wine? Melissa's cut me off. I've been cut off. Sorry.
Very wise.
Satellite museum.
She's a wise woman.
She's a very wise. Well, she can't be that wise. She married me.
Yeah.
So in terms of satellite museums, we don't have a satellite museum, but what we do have are other exhibition spaces in other parts of the National Museum of Ireland. So National Museum of Ireland, is spread across Ireland. It's got several sites around Dublin. It's got a site out in County Mayo. Beautiful site out in County Mayo. And so there are opportunities for us to have kind of exhibitions, smaller exhibitions in some of the other spaces. And certainly back in 2007, 2008, there was a kind of a satellite exhibition when the rest of the museum was closed called the Dead Zoo at Large, which was about, we went into the riding school in the Collins Barracks site. And that was incredible because it's a great opportunity for people to engage with the collection while the main building was shut for some repair works. Not dissimilar to what's going on now. I am currently not planning any exhibitions myself. We've been really fortunate in the last couple of years that we've started to build a number of curators. So just to put this out there, the National Museum of Ireland has been massively understaffed for a very long time. There have been loads of issues, and now we're slowly starting to get up to a more reasonable level of staffing. That goes across the whole of the museum, not just in natural history, but certainly in natural history, it's been felt kind of most strongly. So when I started, there had been just two people, Matthew and Nigel, dealing with 2 million objects, covering the full range of geology and zoology and paleontology. Frankly, in a national museum, it's an impossible task. If you look at other similar sized museums, you might have 14 people, 15, 16 people doing the same job. There were two here. And what that means is there are capacity issues. Now we're building that capacity. We've got a new management team, and we've had we had a new board coming about 5 years ago, who have completely changed the way the museum works, and it's been really refreshing. It's been really positive, really good. I'm a big fan of the current regime. They're awesome, and so as a result, we've been able to grow. So we've got two relatively new curators who have both joined in the last couple of years, like within the last 2 years. And they're both absolutely fantastic guys. There's Aidan and Amy. Amy's the most recent one. And I'm really hoping that they're going to pull something together where we can have some kind of exhibition presence off-site. But frankly, I don't have time to think about any of that kind of stuff at the moment because I've got a big decant to sort out, and once that's done, maybe I'll kind of get involved in that process. and obviously I'll offer support where I can for my kind of young, my more junior colleagues, because suddenly I find myself not being the newbie anymore. I find myself being like the old man in the room, which is kind of scary and happens to many of us, hopefully.
Well, I'd say when you said this actor came and asked where the hair was, I was going to make.
Yeah, it's not
I
here
did
anymore.
actually hear a different spelling.
Yeah, yep.
But anyway, so somebody's just said, sorry, I have to leave you. Thank you, absolutely fascinating. And I've just sent a direct message to somebody. It's very weird how that happens. So hang on a minute. Let me just send a message. Look at Goat Lips mentions Tring Museum near
Oh
where
yeah,
I grew
Tring.
up.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
yeah, you cannot have a conversation about old school natural history museums without mentioning Tring.
Yeah.
To my mind, Tring is the daddy or the mummy or just the OG of traditional museums.
You're older.
Sorry?
We're older.
We're older. You're older. Oh, well, you're much older. Yeah.
Yeah.
A couple of interesting comments. Ronan says he visited British Museum during lockdown. They've made a big effort to contextualize the origins of collections. Display about Sir Hans Sloane, dealing with his controversial past, which is, I mean, there's a lot more of that happening all the time, and it's great. And there's no reason not to at all. There's no excuse not to.
No, that's it. There
I think
is no
Paolo's been
excuse
offered
not
some
to.
more wine, judging by that look.
I did. I got more wine. Thanks, Lisa.
And from Warthogs again, the Powell Cotton Museum in Kent is perhaps unique in the late 19th and early 20th century. All the items he collected were credited to the craftspeople who made them, as far as possible, or the individuals who gave them to him, which is magnificent. I mean, because narrative origin is part of context. Everything has stories for us. We talk about our experiences with museums in terms of narrative, in terms of personal impact. And so, why shouldn't the artifacts in the museums also have a personal as well as a scientific and historical narrative?
Well,
We're
natural history is social history.
yeah,
You can't distinguish them from that because they were collected by someone, they're collected by people. Therefore, they
yeah.
are part of social history. And the Powell Cotton is an incredible museum. If you have an opportunity to go there, you should go there. It's absolutely fantastic, and there are some fantastic people working there. I have a lot of respect for the staff in that place. People like Imbal and Rachel are just, they do an amazing job. They're fantastic. So honestly, if you ever get a chance to go to the Powell Cotton in Kent, I would go. It's a beautiful, wonderful place. They have the best dioramas in the UK. So it's worth it just for that.
I still love the dioramas. Whereabouts in Kent is the Powell Cotton?
It's not far from Margate. Not far from Margate. It's kind of out on its own, but it's not far from Margate.
Kirsten has mentioned the Grant Museum, of course.
We all know about that now.
Not mention the Grant Museum in this context, and indeed the Horniman doing a great job of mixing historical with the personal. And I mean, I have to say, the Horniman, I think, was one of the first I was aware of that really got a good balance between that old school presentation of here's a lot of dead stuffed animals, just like you saw when you were a kid, and this is how things work. This is the life cycle. This is the history. Whatever. I've got to applaud that. We're getting on. It's 9:20, so we've been going for 2 hours.
2 hours.
2 hours. I think it may be time to wrap up. But I think before we go, I need to send you the link to the video. So bear with me while I look for that YouTube video. I think that's the one. Oh no, hang on. Let me just send it. I'll send it to you in chat. I think that's the one. No, that's not the one. That's the YouTube channel. Okay, well, I'll send this to everybody.
This is a documentary.
This is the PubSci YouTube channel, which this is being streamed on. So there's some kind of bizarre recursive thing going on that I'm now talking about the YouTube channel while messaging the YouTube channel, which will soon be broadcast in the YouTube channel. Meanwhile, I'm just going to try and find that video.
I can see a video link. There you
go. Hang on, here we go. Now that's the YouTube one. This is what I'm sending you, Paolo. This is your video, which I can't play the sound for.
Okay, let's see if I can do this.
So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wrap up, and then if we can sort of play out with that video with the sound, if that's okay. So I want to thank everybody for coming along. Again, apologies for the broken quick link. I put so much effort in the tech going that I'm mortified that happened. And I'm going to have to email everybody because some people didn't make it. So hopefully they can watch on YouTube when this is all wrapped up. Thank you so much to Paolo. It's been an absolute delight. It's lovely to see you. It reminds me of the good times in the pub. Most of the time that I've been at PubSci with Paolo is because he was running it and I was in the audience asking annoying, difficult, long, or complex questions.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, that's a good point.
Anyway, and just to remind you, it is in the chat. So what I'm going to do when we're going to kind of close this, but I'm just going to kind of like open up the video and the audio, and I'm going to leave the chat open. Leave the meeting open for a bit, so you can just go back through the chat. You can get the link to YouTube or anything else. Somebody, I think Heather kindly Kirsten put pubsci.info in the chat. Don't forget, we're back on the last Friday of March, which will also be the 26th, with Dr. Erica McAllister, who's got a new Radio 4 program coming out, or it's, I think, coming out next week, I'm not sure, about flies. And sign up for either the emails or subscribe to the long-term planner so you can see everything. Oh, Paolo Viscardi entered the waiting room. I'd better admit him. Hello again, Paolo. Are you muted? Let me find Paolo and unmute him. This is hilarious. Nope, you're there. Make co-host. Right. Paolo's back as co-host. So we're just going to play out with the little video made by RT in Ireland, and then I'm just going to enable video and chat, and we'll just see what chaos ensues. It'll be just like after the pub.
And do you mind if I quickly jump in, Richard, about the documentary?
Yes.
Yes. You do mind? Okay.
No, I don't. yes, do. Sorry, that was. Do I mind? Yes, go ahead. Obviously,
all of the stuff that we've been doing has been with a documentary crew following us around. So literally, like at the absolute worst possible time, we've ended up having a camera in our faces. The guys doing it, Paul and Paddy, have been awesome. They're really good guys. But my God, having them with the camera in our faces at some of these times has been a nightmare. But hopefully the documentary will be really cool. And they're in the process of kind of going through some of the editorial for it. And the idea is that they're going to be doing some kind of final interviews with us next week. Then hopefully the whole thing will be pulled together and it should be broadcast. We're hoping kind of maybe late April, May sort of time. Not 100% sure, but it should be interesting. Maybe. I have no idea. Thanks for that, Richard. Sorry.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, over to you. Thanks for joining. I'm just going to name check a couple of people while Paolo's setting that up. Leslie Cole, Bjorn. We've got Kat, Deborah, I think she's gone. And obviously the PubSci crew who've been keeping the flame burning. Heather and Sam and Kate and Jen. And if you're watching on the YouTube video, Hannah in New Zealand, thank you everyone for joining.
Is Hannah here? Hi, Hannah.
Well, she's not yet, but she will be.
Oh, okay. She will be eventually. Yeah.
She will be. Yeah. So it's a little surprise for you at the end, Hannah. Okay, handing over to you to sign out. Thanks, Paolo. Big round of applause again.
Thanks.
I love the seamless transitions. We're so good at that.
See, you've handed over to me, but
you can't remember what you're doing?
Yeah.
You're playing a video.
My problem is that video didn't work through my phone, so I'm now going to have to log in again on my computer to try to make it work. So, frankly, maybe I'll just act it out.
I thought,
apparently this meeting link is invalid. So
you are joking.
No, I'm not.
The one.
Okay. No, just trying to sign into Zoom, and apparently meeting link is invalid. So
the Zoom link that you were using to be in this meeting.
If you play the video, it has the sound. It has the.
It does have subtitles.
It has subtitles. I'll read out the subtitles. There we go.
Oh yeah, do it in a David Attenborough voice or something like that.
There we go. Perfect.
Yeah,
right, let's just do that. Let's do that. That'd be fun.
So
let's finish this in an irreverent way.
Yes, indeed. Oh, hang on. Here we go. So I'm now gonna share screen, and for some reason I can't get it to share my sound. But this is the video. Where are we? Right. Hopefully you can now see that.
And the Dead Zoo
I'm going to play
dismantled. There we go.
The Dead Zoo dismantled.
Oh, if we're going for that.
This time it's personnel dismantled.
The Dead Zoo is alive. Oh, it's got sound.
Oh, you can hear it.
This should be interesting. It's tall, so it can sway, and if something that heavy sways, it's old as well. It's well over 160 years old. An old bone obviously doesn't flex like new bone does, so there's a really good chance that when we move it, the bone can explode, it can shatter, it can break. And the last thing we want is for that to happen.
It didn't.
A whale dismantling building site.
Every time I see you, Paolo, I'm going to imagine you with that backing music following you.
A handful of people have done this in other parts of Europe in the last decade or so. So there are experts we're going to be using who have that experience. But it will involve taking all of the bones off the suspended metal frames that hold the skeletons together. They've been up there for well over a century, so there's nobody to ask, how did you do it and what exactly is going on? We have to vacuum clean so we can see everything clearly. Then we have to maybe dig away plaster at the tops of bolts that's hiding how
there's a lot more plaster than that.
And very carefully dismantle bone by bone. And we're also dealing with weights of over 3 tons. So we have to make sure from the engineering point of view, as we dismantle whales, that we still have a stable structure, that we don't make it lopsided and heavy at one end.
But there's bits of paper in here that are folded up, and I really want to have a look at them and see what it is.
There were bus tickets and rubbish.
People have clearly in the past been throwing rubbish into the hole in the back of the skull, probably from the balconies when they were opened back in before the balconies were shut down for health and safety reasons. So there are old coins in here. It looks like there's some fruit in here that's dried out. There's all sorts of things. Because people have basically been using the specimen as a waste bin.
as a curator, you become a little bit of a structural engineer, a little bit of a project manager, and a whole pile of other skills that you wouldn't normally associate with the learned side of what we do behind the scenes.
We're not open for visitors at the moment.